step back 10,000 years into the sands of ancient Egypt, where history whispers through pyramids, temples, and forgotten scrolls. This story reveals not just the glory of pharaohs, but the ordinary lives, hidden loves, and daily survival of their people. The land of ancient Egypt 10,000 years ago was both a gift and a challenge, a place where the mighty Nile carved a lifeline through endless stretches of arid desert, allowing human beings to cling to survival in an otherwise unforgiving world. Life was defined by the rhythm of the river, the rise and fall of its waters, the fertile silt it left behind, and the constant threat of scarcity should its flow falter. Every day began with the sun rising over the eastern horizon, painting the desert with burning light, and the people rising with it, bound to the cycles of nature that dictated everything from planting and harvesting to building and worship. The desert was not a place of comfort, but of resilience, and the struggle to survive demanded every ounce of human strength, knowledge, and adaptation passed down from countless generations. For the common Egyptian, survival was not measured by riches or monuments, but by the simple ability to eat, drink, and endure the harshness of the land, a struggle invisible beside the grandeur of pharaohs and their dynasties, yet the very foundation upon which that grandeur was built, food, was a daily preoccupation. For though the Nile provided fertile soil, the abundance was never guaranteed. Villagers toiled in the fields, bent over under the blazing sun, planting emmer wheat and barley, the staples that sustained life. Women ground the grains into flour with stone tools, their arms straining for hours, filling the air with the sound of stone against stone, while men and children carried water from irrigation ditches, keeping the fields alive during the dry seasons. Fishing along the Nile was a crucial supplement, with nets cast into the flowing waters and harpoons thrust from simple boats carved from reeds or wood. Fish, when dried or salted, offered sustenance long after the catch, yet even this required constant effort to secure. Livestock such as goats, sheep, and cattle provided milk, meat, and hides, but they also required grazing land, water, and protection from predators and thieves. Every meal was the result of relentless work, and the fear of a failed harvest or a season of poor flooding haunted every household. The river was generous when it swelled, depositing fertile soil, but if it receded too much or overflowed too wildly, it could spell famine, washing away crops or leaving barren earth. Hunger was a shadow that never truly disappeared, a silent companion in the life of the Pharaoh's people. Water, more precious than any gold or jewels, was another constant struggle. Though the Nile was a source of life, it was not always within easy reach, and drawing water was itself a daily burden. Women carried jars on their shoulders, balancing them with skill as they walked long distances from river to home, their backs aching from the weight. Wells dug deeper inland provided some relief, but not all villages were fortunate enough to have them, and drought could turn survival into desperation. The Nile also posed dangers of its own, from crocodiles lurking near its banks to the diseases carried by its waters, unseen threats that claimed lives without warning. Yet the people depended on it utterly, washing their bodies, watering their animals, irrigating their fields, and praying that it would never abandon them. In the desert, to be without water was to face death directly, and so the river was both a god to be worshipped and a force to be feared. Shelter, too, reflected the struggle for survival in this land of extremes. The blazing sun beat down mercilessly by day, while nights could grow surprisingly cold beneath the open sky. Houses of mud brick, shaped from Nile clay and straw, rose in simple squares, designed to shield families from the heat but fragile against the sands and floods. Families patched walls often, re-layering bricks with their own hands, because time and weather ate away at every structure. Inside, the homes were modest, often little more than a few rooms with mats laid upon the floor, jars for storage, and simple hearths for cooking. The wealthy built larger dwellings, with courtyards and painted walls, but for the majority, life was confined to cramped spaces where survival mattered more than decoration. Sandstorms swept across the land, stinging eyes and choking lungs, forcing families to huddle inside until the winds passed. In such conditions, even a humble roof was a precious defense, and the labor of building and maintaining it was endless. The desert itself was a constant adversary, surrounding the Nile like a sea of death. To venture too far without preparation meant certain doom, for the sands stretched endlessly, offering neither food nor water. Caravans moving through the desert faced unbearable heat, exhaustion, and the risk of losing their way, but they did so out of necessity, trading goods and carrying messages between distant settlements. The people who lived closest to the edges of the desert developed survival knowledge that seemed almost miraculous, learning where to find sparse vegetation, how to travel by the stars, and how to conserve water to its last drop. For those in the heart of the Nile Valley, the desert was both a barrier and a shield, keeping foreign armies and marauders at bay, but also reminding them daily of how fragile their existence was. Every breath of wind carried sand that could smother crops, bury homes, or grind into the skin, leaving the body raw and weary. Survival meant not just resisting the desert, but adapting to it, shaping life in ways that made coexistence possible. However, precarious illness and injury posed another challenge, for survival was never guaranteed in a land where medical knowledge was limited and remedies relied upon herbs, prayers, and ritual. The harsh labor of farming left backs broken and hands calloused, wounds easily infected by dirt and dust. Malaria, fevers, and stomach diseases spread silently, cutting down the young and old alike. Mothers risked their lives in childbirth, and infants often did not survive their first years. Priests and healers tried to mend the sick with poultices, amulets, and incantations, combining practical treatments with spiritual appeals to the gods. Yet for many, survival depended less on medicine than on sheer endurance, the strength of the human body pushed to its limit by the demands of daily life. To live into old age was a rare fortune, a triumph over countless unseen battles fought within the body and against the environment that surrounded it. The work of survival did not end in the fields or the home. For the Pharaohs, people were also conscripted into labor for monumental projects, digging canals, building temples, and raising the massive stones of pyramids that would outlast millennia. To the rulers, these works were symbols of power and divinity, but for the laborers, they were grueling struggles that tested their survival daily. Hands bled from carrying stone, bodies collapsed under the sun, and food was often scarce during long campaigns of work. Though some were paid in bread, beer, and shelter, the toll on the human body was immense, and yet this labor was seen as part of their duty to the land and the gods. The survival of one man was often sacrificed to the survival of the kingdom, and the glory of pharaohs was built upon the quiet suffering of countless individuals whose names were never recorded. Yet even within this hardship, bonds of brotherhood and community formed, for survival was never an individual struggle but a collective one, where every hand mattered and every effort meant the difference between endurance and collapse. Seasons dictated everything, and survival meant obeying the rhythm of time itself. When the Nile flooded, the land was reborn, fields nourished, and hope restored. When the waters retreated, planting began, and the cycle of toil renewed itself. Yet each season brought uncertainty, for too much or too little water meant disaster, and no prayers or rituals could guarantee balance. The people learned to read the signs of nature, the stars above, the winds, the behavior of animals, and they passed this knowledge down generation after generation as the key to survival. Without it, no family could endure, no village could thrive, and the Pharaoh's people would have been swallowed long ago by the desert that loomed around them. In the heart of ancient Egypt, 10,000 years ago, survival may have been the foundation of life, but it was love, family, and relationships that gave life meaning beyond the endless toil. For the people of the Nile Valley, bonds of kinship were not just personal, they were essential to existence itself, woven into every ritual, every home, and every act of labor. The family was the smallest kingdom, ruled not by a pharaoh but by shared duty, affection, and obligation, each member bound together in ways that ensured survival and gave comfort in a land that could be harsh and unforgiving. Love was not a luxury but a necessity, and relationships between husbands and wives, parents and children, brothers and sisters, carried the weight of both emotion and survival. Without these ties, no one could endure the challenges of desert life, no one could build a home, and no one could stand against the uncertainty of famine, disease, or hardship. Marriage was at the center of Egyptian family life, often less a ceremony of grandeur and more an agreement between two households. Yet despite its practical roots, marriage was not devoid of affection. Records and fragments suggest that Egyptian husbands and wives spoke to one another with tenderness, that love poems were written to express longing and devotion, and that marriage could hold both romance and responsibility. A man's role was to provide for his household, tending fields, ensuring food, protecting the home, while a woman's role was to maintain the household, raise children, prepare food, and weave clothing. Yet these roles were not rigid cages. Egyptian women had rights that were surprising for the ancient world: the ability to own property, inherit wealth, and in some cases even divorce. Love could thrive in this balance of labor and duty, creating a partnership where affection and survival intertwined, where the warmth of companionship was as essential as bread and water. The bond between parents and children was deep, for children were both a blessing and a form of security. In a world where life was uncertain and mortality high, having many children meant greater chances that some would survive to adulthood, greater hands to work the fields, and greater assurance that aging parents would be cared for in their later years. Mothers bore the burden of childbirth, often risking their lives, while fathers took pride in passing down knowledge of farming, craftsmanship, and tradition. Childhood was not without its joys, as Egyptian art reveals images of children playing, swimming in the Nile, dancing at festivals, and wearing protective amulets around their necks to guard against evil spirits. Yet childhood was also brief, for at a young age children joined the labor of the household, grinding grain, fetching water, or tending animals. The affection of parents did not erase the reality that every member of the family had to contribute to survival, and the rhythm of love was often matched by the rhythm of work. Siblings played a central role in these households, often sharing not only their childhood, but their adult lives as well. Brothers worked alongside one another in the fields or in construction projects, forming bonds of loyalty and dependence, while sisters supported one another in the domestic sphere, helping with children, weaving, and managing the household. The closeness of siblings sometimes extended beyond the expected, as marriages between brothers and sisters existed among royalty and, in rare cases, among commoners as well. Though modern eyes may find this strange, in ancient Egypt such unions were seen as a way to preserve bloodlines, property, and family continuity. Within the household, love among siblings could be a mixture of affection, rivalry, and obligation, a dynamic as complex as any in history, yet one that anchored the Egyptian sense of belonging to something greater than oneself. Festivals and gatherings provided rare moments when love and relationships stepped beyond the practical and into the realm of joy. Music, dancing, and feasting brought communities together, and within these gatherings young men and women met, courted, and sometimes found their future spouses. Love poems and songs, written in hieroglyphs and carried through oral tradition, spoke of longing glances, stolen kisses, and the beauty of lovers compared to the blossoming of lotus flowers along the Nile. These expressions reveal that beneath the daily grind of survival, passion and affection burned strongly, that men and women sought not only to fulfill duties, but to experience the sweetness of love, the closeness of intimacy, and the comfort of partnership. Even in the silence of mud-brick homes, couples would have shared whispered conversations after long days of toil, the human desire for connection breaking through the hardships of existence. Friendship was another essential bond, less often recorded but no less vital. Men worked together in fields and workshops, sharing tools, sweat, and laughter, their camaraderie making labor bearable. Women gathered at riverbanks, washing clothes and sharing stories, their conversations weaving threads of community that supported one another through childbirth, sickness, and loss. Friendships often extended across generations, with neighbors treating one another's children as their own, stepping in to help when hardship struck. These bonds expanded the concept of family beyond bloodlines, creating a network of relationships that acted as a safety net in a world where survival was never guaranteed. A man without friends, a woman without sisters of the heart, would have faced the desert's cruelty alone, a fate as dangerous as famine or flood. Love also extended into the spiritual realm, for Egyptians believed that relationships endured beyond death. Husbands and wives were often buried together, their tombs inscribed with prayers for reunion in the afterlife. Parents wished to be remembered by their children, offerings placed at tombs to sustain their spirits in eternity. The concept of Ka, the vital essence of a person, meant that the bonds of family did not end at the grave, but continued in another world, and so the living maintained relationships with the dead through rituals, offerings, and remembrance. This spiritual understanding deepened the significance of love and kinship, elevating them from earthly necessities to eternal truths, binding the people not only to one another, but to the divine order that governed all existence. In the royal courts, love and family took on another layer, for pharaohs married not only for affection but for power. Royal marriages forged alliances, cemented claims to the throne, and sometimes reinforced divine legitimacy through unions with siblings. Yet even within these political arrangements, traces of genuine affection appear in the records, pharaohs praising their queens, dedicating monuments to their honor, and sharing tombs with them for eternity. Queens, too, held positions of influence within the family structure of royalty, their relationships with pharaohs shaping the politics of the kingdom and the lives of millions. For the common people, the royal family was both distant and symbolic, yet their own households mirrored these dynamics in miniature, with fathers as the head, mothers as the heart, and children as the continuation of the family line. The roles of love and family were further reinforced by religious beliefs, where gods and goddesses themselves modeled relationships for the people. Isis and Osiris embodied the devotion of a wife who resurrects her husband. Horus represented the filial bond of a son avenging and honoring his father. Hathor symbolized fertility and maternal care. These divine stories were not distant myths, but reflections of the relationships the people valued most, giving their daily lives a sacred mirror. When a woman cared for her child, she echoed Isis cradling Horus. When a husband provided for his wife, he imitated Osiris providing life. In this way, love and family were not merely practical realities, but spiritual ideals, woven into the cosmic order itself. Even in the smallest gestures, the depth of love and connection can be glimpsed. A wife grinding grain late into the evening so her family would eat, a husband repairing a roof so his children would sleep dry, a sister sharing a loaf of bread with her brother, a mother tying an amulet around her child's neck before they ventured outside. These acts of care carried the weight of survival and the warmth of affection. The desert may have been harsh, the Nile unpredictable, but within the walls of each household, love softened the edges of hardship, giving people the strength to endure another day, to hope for another season, and to believe that their bonds would outlast even death itself. The pharaoh in ancient Egypt 10,000 years ago was not simply a ruler in the earthly sense, but the very embodiment of divine will, a figure who stood at the crossroads of human and God, a bridge between heaven and earth. To the people of the Nile, Pharaoh was the living Horus, the son of Ra, the earthly representation of the divine order known as Ma'at. His presence, his commands, and his very existence were seen as the threads that held the universe together. Without Pharaoh, chaos threatened to return. The floods of the Nile could cease, the crops could wither, the enemies beyond the desert could overrun the land, and the dead themselves might wander restless. The secrets of his rule were not simply in armies or wealth, but in the deeply rooted belief that Pharaoh was chosen to preserve balance in a world always at risk of collapsing into disorder. The palace of the Pharaoh was more than a residence. It was the seat of cosmic authority. From its walls, decrees were issued that shaped the daily lives of farmers, soldiers, priests, and craftsmen alike. Every order, every tax, every judgment was cloaked in the authority of divine right, and to disobey was not merely treason against a king, but sacrilege against the gods. Scribes filled rolls of papyrus with Pharaoh's commands, sending them to distant towns where officials enforced his will. The very act of writing was sacred, for words carried the magic of permanence, and the Pharaoh's name, inscribed in hieroglyphs, was thought to endure as long as stone itself. Power rested not only in armies, but in the mastery of symbols, for a word carved in stone could last longer than the life of any man, and the Pharaoh's words were meant to last forever. Religion was inseparable from Pharaoh's rule, for temples rose across the land not only as places of worship, but as centers of power and administration. Priests served the gods but also served the Pharaoh, reinforcing his divine connection. Festivals dedicated to the gods, often celebrated Pharaoh as well, for he was believed to be their representative on earth, the one who offered sacrifices on behalf of his people. Statues carved with his likeness were placed in temples so that even in his absence his presence was felt, and rituals were carried out as though he himself were there. Secrets of rule were preserved in these sacred spaces, for temples controlled vast lands, stored grain, and maintained wealth that could rival even the palace itself. Yet all was under Pharaoh's ultimate authority, and through religious devotion he ensured loyalty, for to question him was to question the gods themselves. The power of Pharaoh extended through a network of officials, viziers, governors, tax collectors, and soldiers who carried out his commands. The vizier was the pharaoh's right hand, overseeing everything from the courts to the treasury, ensuring that the will of the divine ruler was executed with precision. Governors managed provinces, collecting grain as tax, maintaining order, and mobilizing labor when Pharaoh demanded it. Soldiers patrolled borders, defended trade routes, and enforced the peace within the kingdom. Yet all these men drew their authority not from themselves but from Pharaoh, and their power could be stripped away at his command. This hierarchy ensured that every action, from the planting of a field to the building of a temple, was in some way tied to the will of the ruler. Secrets of power lay in this structure of obedience, where loyalty flowed upward like the waters of the Nile. Feeding the throne with devotion and service control of resources was another key to Pharaoh's authority. The Nile's fertile land was divided and taxed, grain collected and stored in granaries under the watchful eyes of officials loyal to the crown. In times of abundance, this grain could be distributed to maintain stability, feeding workers on massive building projects, rewarding soldiers, or supporting temple rituals. In times of famine, Pharaoh's control of these stores gave him the appearance of divine providence, the one who could ensure survival when nature seemed to fail. Gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, incense from Punt, lapis lazuli from far-off lands, all flowed into Egypt through trade and tribute, filling the treasuries and enhancing Pharaoh's glory. These goods were not mere luxuries, but symbols of Egypt's reach, proof that Pharaoh's power extended beyond the desert borders. Pulling wealth from distant lands into his domain, war and conquest also played their role, for Pharaoh was not only a priest and a king but a warrior. Armies marched under his banner, chariots rattling across desert sands, spears flashing in the sun, banners fluttering with the symbols of gods. Victories were recorded in carvings, walls of temples decorated with scenes of Pharaoh smiting his enemies, his figure towering above them, larger than life, proof of his divine favor. Prisoners of war were paraded in chains, foreign lands brought under Egyptian influence, and tribute poured into the treasury. Yet the truth behind these triumphs often lay in the careful use of propaganda, for the people rarely saw the battles themselves, only the stories inscribed in stone, ensuring that Pharaoh's image as invincible remained unshaken. The secret of this power was not only in the sword but in the story, for belief in his strength could be as effective as the strength itself. Architecture and monuments revealed another layer of Pharaoh's secrets. For every stone placed in a pyramid, every obelisk raised toward the heavens, was both a demonstration of might and a message to the future. These monuments required immense labor, tens of thousands of workers hauling blocks of stone, carving inscriptions, and shaping landscapes into symbols of eternity. To the common eye, these were acts of devotion, tributes to gods and ancestors, but beneath the surface they were instruments of power. The sheer scale of these projects reminded all who saw them that Pharaoh commanded not only the present, but the future, that his name would echo long after his body returned to the earth. Secrets were buried within tombs, chambers filled with treasures, writings, and spells meant to carry Pharaoh into eternity, and though looters and time sought to rob them, the idea of immortality was already secured in stone and memory. Knowledge itself was a secret weapon of Pharaoh's rule. Astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and writing were guarded and cultivated within temples and palaces, accessible only to the educated elite, primarily scribes and priests loyal to the throne. The ability to read the stars and predict the flooding of the Nile, the skill to calculate taxes, the knowledge to heal wounds or interpret omens, these forms of wisdom were not shared with all but concentrated in the hands of those who served Pharaoh. To the common people, this knowledge seemed like magic, and those who wielded it reinforced the perception that Pharaoh's rule was divinely guided. By controlling access to wisdom, Pharaoh ensured that power remained centralized, that no rival could challenge the sacred order without also challenging the gods themselves. The rituals of kingship themselves carried layers of secret meaning. The crowns Pharaoh wore were not mere decorations but symbols of rule over Upper and Lower Egypt, the unification of the two lands embodied in his person. The crook and flail he held in his hands symbolized kingship and fertility, shepherding and discipline, reminders of his role as both protector and provider. Ceremonies of coronation were not simply political but cosmic, reaffirming that Pharaoh was chosen by the gods to maintain Ma'at, the balance of all things. Each festival, each ritual, each offering to the gods was an act of governance as much as worship, weaving power into religion so tightly that the two could never be separated. To the people, Pharaoh's rule was as natural as the rising sun, and questioning it would be as unthinkable as questioning the Nile's flood. Behind the grandeur and the divine imagery, however, were human struggles and political intrigues, whispers in the shadows of the palace. Advisors and viziers wielded influence, rivals within the royal family vied for power, generals weighed loyalty against ambition. Though official records celebrated harmony and order, the reality was often filled with negotiations, betrayals, and secret plots. Yet Pharaoh's image endured untarnished, for the machinery of rule ensured that any weakness was concealed, any failure reframed as victory. The secret of Pharaoh's power was not perfection, but the ability to project it, to maintain the illusion of divine invincibility even when the reality was more fragile. Stone inscriptions, monumental architecture, rituals, and symbols all worked together to weave a tapestry so convincing that the people never doubted the eternal strength of their ruler. Even death itself did not strip Pharaoh of power, for the transition to the afterlife was prepared with the same care as his reign on earth. The embalming of the body, the wrapping in linen, the placing in sarcophagi, and the sealing of tombs were not acts of mourning alone, but acts of preservation of authority. Pharaoh's Ka, his spirit, was believed to continue ruling in the afterlife, ensuring the stability of the world even beyond his mortal years. Priests recited spells, offerings were placed, treasures were buried, all to sustain his rule in eternity. For the people left behind, the death of a pharaoh was not the end of his reign, but the continuation of it on another plane, with the successor merely stepping into the same divine role, ensuring that the cycle of order endured without break. In the vast desert land of ancient Egypt 10,000 years ago, life was harsh and uncertain. Yet the people believed they were never truly alone. All around them they saw the hands of unseen powers, shaping the flood of the Nile, the growth of crops, the path of the sun, the whisper of the wind, and even the silence of death. Their world was filled with gods, each one tied to the elements that determined whether they would thrive or suffer. To the Egyptians, the divine was not distant, but present in every moment of life, and so survival was as much a matter of faith as it was of labor. The cycle of birth, toil, and death found meaning in spiritual beliefs that promised order in chaos, justice in uncertainty, and life beyond the grave. The gods were everywhere, not only in towering temples, but in the mud-brick homes of farmers, in amulets worn around the necks of children, in the stars above the desert, and in the fields that stretched along the Nile's banks. At the center of Egyptian belief was the principle of Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. Ma'at was truth, balance, harmony, and justice, a cosmic law that kept the world from falling into chaos. Pharaoh himself was seen as the guardian of Ma'at, but every person, no matter how humble, was expected to live in accordance with it. To lie, to steal, to neglect offerings, to dishonor family was to disturb Ma'at, and the punishment might come not only in this life, but in the judgment that awaited after death. People lived with the constant awareness that their actions were measured, that even if human eyes did not see, the gods always did. This belief in a universal order gave structure to society, a sense that survival was not only physical but moral, and that the unseen balance of the world depended upon both rulers and farmers alike. The pantheon of Egypt was immense, filled with gods and goddesses who touched every aspect of existence. Ra, the sun god, traveled across the sky each day and through the underworld each night, his daily journey a reminder of renewal and hope. Osiris, god of the dead, ruled the afterlife, embodying resurrection and eternal life. Isis, his devoted wife, represented love, magic, and motherhood, a goddess who comforted the grieving and protected children. Horus, the falcon-headed son of Osiris and Isis, symbolized kingship and protection, his sharp eyes watching over the land as Pharaoh embodied his spirit on earth. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, guarded the tombs and guided souls into the afterlife. Hathor, goddess of music, fertility, and joy, blessed lovers and mothers alike. Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, recorded the deeds of men and the judgments of the gods. Every household invoked different deities depending on their needs, and every community celebrated festivals to honor them, filling the land with rituals that tied the earthly to the divine. Temples were the great houses of the gods, rising from stone along the banks of the Nile, places where priests carried out daily rituals to feed, clothe, and honor the divine statues within. To the people outside, the temple was both a holy sanctuary and a reminder of the gods' constant presence. Ordinary Egyptians might not enter the inner sanctuaries, but they gathered in courtyards, left offerings, and prayed for blessings. Temples were not only spiritual centers but economic hubs, owning land, managing granaries, and employing laborers, their wealth and power rivaling even the palace. Yet the people did not see them as separate from daily life, but as extensions of the cosmic order, where priests performed duties on their behalf, ensuring that the gods were satisfied and that the balance of Ma'at continued unbroken. To neglect the gods was to invite disaster, for famine, plague, or foreign invasion could be interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. Magic, or Heka, was another layer of Egyptian belief, not seen as superstition but as a natural force woven into the world. Heka was the power the gods used to create the universe, and humans, too, could access it through rituals, spells, and amulets. Mothers tied charms around their children's necks to ward off illness, workers carved protective symbols on tools and doors, and priests recited incantations to heal the sick or protect the dead. Magic was everywhere, not as an alternative to religion, but as part of it, a sacred science that connected the seen and unseen. Even the written word carried magical power, for hieroglyphs were believed to hold the essence of what they represented. To write a name was to preserve a soul, to carve a symbol was to make it real. This understanding of Heka gave weight to every act of inscription, every ritual uttered, and every offering placed upon an altar. The afterlife was the ultimate concern, for death was not seen as an end, but a passage. Egyptians believed that when a person died, their soul embarked on a journey through the underworld, facing trials and dangers before reaching judgment. The heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the Hall of Two Truths, overseen by Osiris and recorded by Thoth. If the heart was heavier than the feather, burdened with lies and sins, it was devoured by the monstrous Amit, and the soul ceased to exist. If the heart was lighter, the soul was granted entry into the field of reeds, a paradise where life mirrored the earthly world, but free of pain and hunger. There, the dead could farm eternally fertile fields, drink from clear waters, and live with their loved ones forever. This vision of eternal life shaped how Egyptians lived, urging them to act with righteousness, honor the gods, and prepare carefully for death. Preparation for the afterlife was not only spiritual but physical, for the body was believed to house the soul, and its preservation was essential for the journey. Thus arose the practice of mummification, an intricate process of cleansing, embalming, wrapping, and sealing the body so it would endure for eternity. Organs were removed and placed in canopic jars, each guarded by protective deities. The body was wrapped in linen, layer upon layer, while amulets were inserted between the wrappings to shield the soul on its journey. Masks were placed upon the face, often gilded or painted, to ensure recognition in the afterlife. The coffin and tomb became extensions of the body itself, decorated with spells, prayers, and images to guide and protect. For pharaohs and nobles, tombs were vast monuments, filled with treasures, food, clothing, and tools meant to provide comfort in eternity. Even for the common people, modest burials included amulets, small offerings, and tokens of love from family, for no one wished to face the afterlife unprepared. The tombs themselves were seen as doorways between worlds, carved deep into rock or raised as pyramids above the sands. They were designed not only as resting places but as eternal homes for the soul. Walls were covered with scenes of daily life, banquets, hunts, festivals, and family gatherings, reminders of the joys the deceased hoped to experience again. Hieroglyphs inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead or earlier coffin texts provided instructions, prayers, and protections, a guidebook for navigating the dangers of the underworld. Paintings of gods, guardians, and sacred symbols filled the chambers, ensuring that every step of the soul's journey was prepared. For the living, building and visiting tombs was an act of devotion, ensuring that their loved ones would not be forgotten and that their spirits would continue to receive offerings long after their passing. Festivals tied to death and rebirth reinforced these beliefs in daily life. The annual festival of Osiris, for example, reenacted the god's death and resurrection, reminding the people that life triumphed over death, that renewal was possible even in the face of decay. During such festivals, statues of the gods were carried in processions, hymns were sung, and offerings were made, uniting the living and the dead in a shared cycle of remembrance. For the people of Egypt, these festivals were not only acts of worship, but assurances that the universe was stable, that their place within it was secure, and that death was not to be feared, but to be prepared for with devotion and care. The stars above were also tied to spiritual belief, for the Egyptians saw in them the souls of the departed and the eternal guardians of the heavens. The constellation Orion was linked to Osiris, while Sirius, the brightest star, was associated with Isis, its rising each year marking the coming of the Nile flood. To look at the night sky was to see not emptiness, but a map of divine order, a reminder that the gods watched over them from above. The alignment of temples and pyramids to the stars reflected this connection, anchoring the earthly realm to the heavens, ensuring that every sacred structure participated in the cosmic order. Astronomy was not separate from faith, but a way of understanding the will of the gods, and the people believed that the patterns in the sky echoed the eternal truths that governed both life and death. Animals, too, carried spiritual weight, for many gods were depicted with animal forms or features embodying the strengths and qualities of creatures revered in the natural world. Cats were sacred to Bastet, protector of the home and goddess of fertility. Crocodiles were linked to Sobek, a god of strength and protection whose temples stood along the Nile. Falcons symbolized Horus, jackals represented Anubis, bulls embodied fertility and strength in connection to Apis. To harm these creatures was considered dangerous, for they were not merely animals, but vessels of divine presence. Families kept cats not only for pest control, but as protectors imbued with sacred energy, and animals were sometimes mummified and buried as offerings to the gods, further weaving the natural and spiritual worlds together. Even dreams were considered messages from the divine, visions that carried warnings, blessings, or glimpses of the future. Dream books inscribed on papyrus listed symbols and their meanings, helping priests interpret what an individual had seen while sleeping. A dream of clear water might signal prosperity, while a dream of darkness could foretell illness or misfortune. For ordinary Egyptians, dreams were personal encounters with the gods, moments when the veil between worlds lifted, allowing the spiritual realm to touch the earthly. These nightly visions reinforced the sense that the unseen world was always near, shaping not only grand events but the intimate details of daily life. Through all these beliefs, the Egyptians created a world where death was never final, where gods shaped every moment, and where life was part of an eternal cycle. The harshness of the desert, the uncertainty of the Nile, the frailty of the human body were softened by the conviction that the universe was ordered, that balance was maintained, and that love, devotion, and righteousness would carry the soul beyond the grave into a paradise that mirrored the beauty of the Nile itself.